Hello, and welcome to the webinar, A Practical Guide to Implementing Effective Business Intelligence Governance. My name is Eric Wallace with Argyle, and it's great to have everyone joining us today. I have a few administrative details to share with you, and then we'll dig into our discussion. First, we'd like to thank Metric Insights for their partnership with today's event. They've been wonderful thought leadership partners to Argyle and are committed to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. Thank you again to Metric Insights. We appreciate your joining us here today. We welcome you to stay connected during today's event. For those of you who are active tweeters, please follow us on Twitter at Argyle Exec Forum. I also wanted to take a moment to touch on our content neutrality policy, which we've curated based on the feedback we've received over the years from our members. Argyle is very proud and protective of this policy, as it reflects our commitment to ensure the neutrality and overall value of the content presented at our events. We've worked closely with our speaking faculty to ensure that you receive a set of balanced and neutral viewpoints during the session today, and we appreciate our members' support of this policy. Finally, and most importantly, please submit all questions that come up during today's event into the chat section of the interface. Following the discussion, we've set aside time for our speaker to weigh in on these questions. Before we start our discussion, I'd like to ask our panelist to introduce himself.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. My name's Mike Smitheman. I head up sales and marketing over here at Metric Insights, and I look forward to talking with you today. So yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for joining me. I must apologize. We had a second speaker lined up to talk with me today, but he's come down with the flu, and obviously you can't be too careful in the current environment. So you're stuck with me. But as Eric mentioned, we're going to be discussing how to implement effective BI governance, and I hope what you get out of this is really some tips and tools to take back to your organization, and there may be things that you can leverage here that you can implement there. So let's start by really defining what I mean by BI governance, and really in the context of what I'm going to be discussing today. When people think about governance, they often focus on what I would refer to as data governance. So basically ensuring the integrity and the security of the data elements that you have in the warehouse or wherever in your organization. And often this becomes sort of a very technical effort confined to the technical data teams. But reality is, in most organizations, data is not consumed in its raw form. You know, we create analytics and reports and dashboards to visualize the data. And ultimately, that's how most business users in an organization are consuming it. So at the end of the day, if the data is well governed, but there's really no structure or governance around the analytics themselves, and by that I mean sort of the charts, the visualizations, the reports, the dashboards, the calculations in there, then really you're lacking in terms of a governance process. And so it's really this marrying of the governance of the data with the governance of the reports and the dashboards and analytics that I'm going to be referring to as BI governance. And I realize it's semantics, but think of it in terms of the full end-to-end process of governance in the organization. So I saw an interesting quote from Gartner, and I'll read it to you. What they said was, through 2022, only 20% of organizations investing in information governance initiatives will succeed in scaling those initiatives across the enterprise. So effectively what they're saying is, 80% of governance initiatives that are sort of targeted enterprise-wide next year are going to fail. And that's kind of staggering and not very impressive. And if true, means that we're going to be wasting a lot of time and effort in this space if we're not careful. But honestly, to me, it's not a huge surprise. And that's because scaling governance initiatives beyond sort of a single department or a single use case, where it's really adopted enterprise-wide, and doing that effectively, where it's not just sort of this necessary evil process, but it's really adding value, not just to the teams that are performing the governance, but to the end users themselves, where they're getting value and we're showing ROI on this practice, is actually a difficult and complex task. And so, the reason behind that is there needs to be a lot of moving parts. Obviously, you need to have the right people in the right roles with the right responsibilities to carry out the processes that you put in place, and that they're able to execute on those effectively. And you need an effective technology layer to be able to implement and, more importantly, measure the effectiveness of any programs or processes that you put in place. And so today we're going to be discussing sort of these three moving parts and give you some ideas around how you can start to tee up governance, in these three areas to be more successful, making sure you're not part of that 80% that Gartner is talking about. So let's start with roles and responsibilities. And what we've typically seen is that there's really three constituents that have to get involved in this to be effective. And the first is really sort of the business owner. It's typically the business that are responsible for defining the way in which things are measured and analyzed in the organization. So, what defines enterprise churn? What defines sales? How are our territories or geographies broken up? What are the different product groupings that we have? And these definitions are typically the business owner's responsibility, and they should be accountable for those for a particular use case that they're trying to implement. The BI analyst is really then the implementer of that business logic. So they're obviously working with the BI and analytics and reporting tools to come up with an effective way of visualizing the use cases at hand, and ensuring that they put the correct analysis in place in a way that it's obviously accurate, in a way that it's intuitive, in the way that is categorized and has context for the end users, so that they know it's there and they can trust it. And then finally, you have effectively the data stewards who, these may be dedicated data governance folks, or they may be data engineers who are responsible for sort of ETL and pipelining work. Either way, they're responsible for making sure that the data is sourced from the right place, that it's transformed correctly, that it's processed correctly, that it's of high quality all the time, and ultimately that it's landing in the right place at the right time for the analytics that are going to be built on top of it. And so, broadly speaking, these are the roles that we see are critical to the BI governance effort. And of course, these may be multiple individuals. It could be the same person taking on, multiple roles. Oftentimes in large enterprises, there's multiple teams with multiple people taking on these roles and these actions and performing some of the processes that we're going to talk about within the rest of the presentation. So, if we think about a simple example here to sort of hammer this point home, let's say, we're going to create, we have a sales use case. We're going to create a report or dashboard that shows rep attainment against goals. What are their commission payouts going to be? What's their projected performance? So that each rep for their territory can see exactly how they stand. Well, in this case, the business owner is probably sales operations or even sales management. They're going to be responsible for defining those commission calculations. They're going to be responsible for setting up how attainment is calculated. What are the goals for each rep? How are the territories broken up? What are the product groupings that we're going to be targeting our reps on? The business analyst is going to be implementing that logic. What are the best ways to visualize data? What calculations do we need in the reports? what filters are appropriate, how we go and ensure security and permissions are maintained, and effectively implementing that business logic on top of the rule definitions that the business has put in place. And then finally, obviously, we'll have the data stewards who are going to be responsible for sourcing that data, say from Salesforce, staging it into our warehouse, making sure we pulled the correct goals from, say, our financial system, putting the necessary ETL and transformation processes in place, the necessary quality checks, and ensuring everything is timed correctly so that the analytics are accurate and up to date for our users. And so you can see how these three roles are really needed to work together to ensure that what the end users are looking at, what the end result is timely, has the right context, and ultimately what we're really striving for here is something that the users can trust. So let's move on to process. And one thing we see all the time in organizations is that we try and sort of define a one-size-fits-all approach to governance. And typically when we try and do that, one of two things happens. In an environment where governance is almost required, if there's either sort of heavy regulatory requirements in general, or that your existing data and BI environment is such a mess that to get anything out there requires a lot of checks and balances in place to create something effective. What ends up happening is we put in really heavyweight processes for governance that almost become a blocker to delivering BI effectively. It becomes so difficult to actually get analytics to our end users that the sort of the speed of BI development and the speed of BI delivery becomes hampered. Or on the other end of the scale, at the end of the day, no one sort of gets excited about governance often. No one gets up every day striving to get excited about sort of categorize and certifying analytics. They enjoy the creation and the innovation of that content. So to check a box, companies will put in a very lightweight process that ultimately rarely gets used and doesn't really add in any value to what we're creating. So it's kind of like, what's the point in the first place? I kind of like the analogy here. It's almost like if I started a clothing store, and rather than stocking sort of different sizes and different styles, like you would imagine, I just pick one suit in an average style, in an average size, based on my client base. The reality is I'm not going to make many sales of that suit. It's only going to be appropriate for a very small number of my customers. And well, governance is kind of the same. A one-size-fits-all approach actually ends up becoming a nothing-fits-anyone approach, and ultimately becomes a burden to the organization, a burden to the BI teams, and really adds little or no value to what we're doing. So what can we do differently? What can we do instead? And I'd like to give you some sort of tools that may help you frame how you think about these things in your organization. And what I'd like to suggest is that it all kind of starts with this idea of one size doesn't fit all, and you have to classify your content so that ultimately you can decide what the appropriate level of governance is for the particular piece of content that you're creating. And a good way to do this is via a grid like this. What we have here is on the one axis across the top is kind of the audience size. And this is simply how wide a usage is a particular report that you're creating or dashboard that you're creating going to have in the organization. Is it one or two people? Is it departmental? Is it something that's going to be used broadly across the whole organization? On the other axis, we have the business impact. So excuse me, how mission critical is this to your organization? Or really rather, what are the implications to the business if an error creeps into it, or if there's an issue with the particular report that you're sending out, or it's delayed in getting to users? Is this a piece of content that's going to be mission critical, and we're taking decisions based on it all the time, and therefore there's high consequences? Is it more sort of medium impact? The business is not going to come to a grinding halt if we have an issue with this particular piece of content, but there are going to be repercussions if something is wrong with it. Or is it more sort of informational and just backs up other things that we have in place? And each piece of content that you create can fit into a grid like this and map to the roles and responsibilities that we spoke about in the first section. And so, to drill into this a little bit more, right, at the one end of the scale where something has low business impact, is going out to a small audience. Well, in this scenario, accountability can just be typically put on the business analyst, right? They can take responsibility for defining and sourcing the correct data, right? What they need to create the analytics, and they can make sure it's accurate and trustworthy and certify this content for the business. And it's important, to point out, we're not talking about producing content of less quality here. In this case, we're simply saying that we don't need to over-engineer the process or use up people's time on it, because it's a report we want to publish and get out there, but probably it wouldn't get created if we had to push it through a cumbersome process. As they say, the juice wouldn't be worth the squeeze if we had to do that. And so the analyst should take accountability for their work, push it out to the users, and be responsible for any issues or updates or changes in it. Another example may be where it has broader adoption and more importance. So typically in these scenarios, you probably want to look at getting buy-in from the business more. And so assigning some of that accountability in the governance process helps ensure, what's being produced, again, is accurate and trustworthy and useful. And so in this scenario, a two-person process can be useful. So the business gets involved, they get involved with helping define and check the content and adding in classification for that content. And the analyst is responsible for the implementation of it. And then finally, there's those high impact, large audience use cases where it does require, in a lot of cases, a heavier process. There's high risk if things go wrong, so you want to bring in both the business owner and the analyst, but you also want to introduce the data steward, who becomes responsible for making sure there's a high level of confidence around the data that is sourcing the analytics that we're putting in place. And so you can imagine that you could go through this and you could fill in the rest of the grid. And now you have a mapping for at least who should be involved in the process based on the type of content that you're producing. So what are some of the steps then in the process of governance? And let's talk about sort of what's typically involved in a process. And here we're talking about what happens after a report or dashboard is created, right? The business requirements have already been defined and we've kind of implemented a report or a solution. Well, first off, we want to make sure there's some sort of data quality checks going on. So depending, again, where our content falls within that grid, these may have differing levels of complexity. But in essence, what we want to make sure is that the data that's going out each time that the report updates is accurate and trustworthy to our users. So we should be actively monitoring somehow the data behind these reports to ensure that, again, the data that is going out is good. Secondly, we want to add the appropriate level of classifications to the content. So particularly sort of in terms of how it should be used by our users. So for example, is it internal data? Is it sensitive information? Or is it public data? Does it contain any, say, personal identifiable information? Any classification that will ensure anyone using the content knows what it is, and more importantly, how it should be used. Things like, if it contains personal information, I probably shouldn't be downloading it or printing it, that sort of thing. Thirdly, what's the appropriate level of documentation? Should I tag it with sort of release notes or help docs? How complex is a report and how often is it changing? And if necessary, I should be adding in any appropriate documentation that's going to, again, ultimately help the end user use that piece of content. Oops. Fourth, we should be tagging it with any what we refer to as glossary terms, but really any sort of business definitions or metrics that are referred to within the report. So we all know these scenarios where sales is calculated 100 different ways, and to the end user, I never really know what I'm looking at within a report. So having some level of governance around the terms that exist and the metrics that exist can help, again, the end users use that report in its correct context. And finally, someone needs to ultimately give the content a stamp of approval and certify it so that end users, again, know they can trust it and who's accountable for it. And if we think back to our roles and responsibilities again, depending on where your content falls within that grid, different resources will get involved. So for the simple use case, the analysts will typically take responsibility for all these steps. Again, they're going to occur, but it doesn't require a lot of constituents to do this. For the second use case, we probably want to get the business owner involved in terms of, helping with tagging of the glossary terms and certifying the content and owning that content. And for our complex use cases, again, the data steward is probably going to jump in and have some accountability for the quality of the data and how it's classified. Another thing to think about when it relates to process is governance should never be a one-time thing. BI is this moving beast, as we all know, right? None of your reports have an indefinite or an infinite lifespan. And so it's important to think as part of your governance process that there needs to be some sort of review process associated with it. And again, in line with our theme here, there isn't kind of a one-size-fits-all to reviewing. And there's really three areas that we're going to look at, but two on this slide that typically trigger a review process after something is published. So either I'm going to publish a report, and it's something that needs to be reviewed sort of on a calendar schedule. So maybe on the first of the month or the first of the quarter when the data updates. Or it's something that's going to, after an elapsed period of time, be something that we want to revisit and see whether it's something that needs reviewing. And so the process for that review then typically across the top takes one of two guises. Either there's sort of an automatic decertification of the content, where we're going to push it back into the review process and ultimately certify it again. Or it may be something like our simple example where after 6 or 12 months, we're just going to review that content again, see whether it's still relevant. And if we deem something has changed, we may want to update it and put it back into our governance process again to have it recertified. As well as time-based events, another thing that can trigger a review process is changes to the content. And again, they can be classified in two different ways. So you may have a low risk changes, let's say we change the description of a particular report. Well, in that case, we may want to trigger a notification to the owners of that report to say, hey, something was updated. Do you want to push this back into a review process? Do you want to recertify this? And probably not in that case. Or there could be high risk changes where actually, for example, we change the definition of the metrics within there. We change the way we define sales. We change the calculation behind it. In that scenario, we might want a process that actually automatically decertifies that piece of content, pushes it back into the governance process, ensures that it goes through those checks and balances again before we push it out to our users. And so, let's walk through a couple of examples of how this might work in practice then, and how you might go about sort of going through this process. So the first one is, let's say we have this requirement for a network performance report. And this is going to be a report that is ultimately going out to a small audience. It's a few people on our network and IT team. It actually has a pretty low business impact. It's going to show us, on a weekly and monthly basis, what sort of the trends are around our network performance and infrastructure performance. And it actually has a low business impact in terms of criticality, because reality is we have other systems where if there's an outage or something slows down, we're going to get alerted to that. So this really is for sort of informational purposes. Well, in that scenario, it's probably one of these simple use cases where the analyst can just take ownership of the whole process. And it's also something where, really we're just going to review this every 6 or 12 months to see, is it still useful? If it is, have we changed anything? Do we need to, recertify it, or is it still good to go? So a sort of one-person governance process in that case. If we take our sales example again, where, in this case, we're going to produce a sales report or dashboard that is going out to the wider sales team. It's going to show all the reps, their performance against goal. It's going to show their quota attainment. It's actually going to show their commission payouts. Well, in this scenario, it's obviously a bigger audience that it's going to. And whilst, the business is not going to come to a grinding halt if there's problems with the content, there is a business impact here. We want to keep morale in our sales team up. We don't want to be giving them incorrect commission amounts, right, that they're not happy with. So, there is a level of business impact here. So we probably want to go pull in the sales operations team and sales management to have some accountability with this process as well, and make sure that they're ultimately owning this content as it goes out to the sales team. And in this case, because every quarter we're going to update the goals and we're going to update the commission calculations, we probably want to automatically decertify it every quarter and make sure, again, we push it through a process. So by the time the sales team gets the report, they know exactly that they can trust it, and we're confident that the data is up to date. And then our final example is, maybe we have our monthly fiscal reporting. It's going out to our board, and potentially, we're a public company, so there's regulatory stuff around these numbers. It's certainly going out to our board and our management team. And whilst that's a small audience, it has a huge business impact. If we get these numbers wrong, we probably want to pull in our data steward to make sure that there is a high level of confidence in terms of how things are being collected, that the data is up to date, the business owner is making sure that everything is defined right, and the analyst is executing on the report effectively. And similarly to our sales example, on the first day of every month, when we update the data and push it out, we want to make sure that everything is perfect, so everyone is getting involved in this case. So the third pillar that I want to touch on is the technology behind this. So most environments that you're all working within, I'm sure, are pretty complex when it comes to BI. So typically we're working in very heterogeneous environments where reporting exists in many different technologies. Reporting, we have multiple BI and analytics tools, and to do governance in that sort of environment is actually quite challenging. And so, we believe you need some sort of technology layer in place to be able to support the sort of thing, the implementation of the sort of things that we've been talking about. And I'm going to show you sort of how Metric Insights sort of brings some of these things to reality. But however you do it, you should be thinking about these sort of pieces of functionality. And the first is this concept of having BI all in one place, even though you have different tools on the back end. So we refer to this sort of as a BI portal, and it's really this space or this catalog where BI teams can publish content in a governed way, but then end users can actually get value out of the governance process. And I'll show you what I mean by that. So it's not just something that sort of happens in a vacuum. The second piece of technology you need as part of this is a way of implementing those governance workflows that I spoke about that may be single individuals or multiple people involved with it, where ultimately you can implement and track and manage a workflow that takes a piece of content from creation to publication in a certified way. And then you need technology that allows you to measure the compliance of the process, but also whether it's adding any value to your organization. And I'll touch on some of the metrics that you might want to think about in terms of, how do we know whether governance, other than the fact that we're doing it, is actually having a positive effect on us being a data-driven organization. And so I'm going to switch across to the Metric Insights platform and just kind of give you a flavor for what this might look like in reality. But again, whatever technology you use to do this is up to you at the end of the day. So let's jump across to my browser here. Okay, so I hope this isn't too small on your screen, and I will try my best to sort of zoom in to what I'm talking about. But I'm going to take you through those sort of three buckets. And the first, I'm going to focus on it a little bit from sort of an end user perspective, because I think we all think about governance in terms of benefiting the teams that are sort of implementing the governance processes, but actually governance should also benefit the end users, the consumers of analytics. And so what you're looking at here is I'm actually in the Metric Insights platform in what we call our catalog view. And think of this as sort of an aggregated view of BI in your organization, a library or a catalog where users can come and consume BI irrespective of the underlying technologies that reports or dashboards might be in. And so actually what you're looking at here, and I'm not going to go into a lot of detail, is each of these tiles is actually a particular report or dashboard or document that I have access to within the organization. And it's something that's been published in a governed way by our teams that we'll look at in a minute. And if I drill in on a particular tile here, and I'll try and make it a little bit bigger for us, what you see here is a preview of this particular piece of content. So obviously I'm looking at the sales analysis report. I get a preview as the end user of what this dashboard actually looks like without even going into it. So this is an up-to-date view of the dashboard. But on the right-hand side, I get access to the categorization of this content that has been created as part of our governance process. So what is that? It's things like, who the owners of this content is, so I know who's responsible and accountable for it. It's things like, when was the data last updated, so I know how fresh the information is, and whether I can trust it's up to date with the questions that I have of it. It's things like the classification of the content that we spoke about. So, is this internal sensitive information? Is it publicly available information? Does it contain PII data and therefore is very sensitive or not? How are the terms that are included in this report actually defined? So if this has sales metrics in there, what are those things? How are they described? How is it calculated? And so without even going into the report itself, I've got the context and categorizations that this is actually something that is going to answer the question that I'm trying to ask. It may also have documentation attached to it, like we spoke about before, so release notes and definitions. It may even we may even want to expose sort of things like lineage of the content. So where did this content come from? Where's it being used? I can see it's part of an email distribution that's going out to me as well. So really, again, trying to take all that information that we've gathered through the publication and governance of this content and making it available to the end user. And last but not least, having this piece of content certified with a stamp of approval, when it was certified and by whom, gives me the context that I can trust it. And obviously, if this is a piece of content that I want to look at, I can drill into the live dashboard. In this case, it's in Tableau. I can interact with it without leaving this catalog or portal and still have access to all that metadata and categorization that we spoke about before. And the idea of a portal is that I should be able to go and search through a catalog of content that I have access to, regardless of the underlying technology that it might have come from. Do things like focus in on just the certified content, but get access again to all that categorization and that context, so that again I've got confidence and know that this content is trustworthy. So part one is about implementing some sort of aggregation layer in your organization where both the content can be published but also consumed in a consistent way. Part two then is, how does the content get into that portal? Well, you need technology that will support some sort of workflow process, some sort of business process around publication. And for us, that's about supporting the different resources that we spoke about through the different processes that we spoke about in that process flow, the data quality, the adding of context, the certification process. And a process for us, is again a number of steps that need to occur during that publication. That it's going to go through a number of review steps where either we're looking at the data or we're adding context and categorization to that content before it gets published to our end users. And so, let's look at a very simple example. So let me try and zoom in a little bit here. So in a simple example where maybe, I'm the analyst responsible for every step that we spoke about, I may have certain reports and dashboards coming into my queue as I create them or as they get published. I'm responsible for doing things like assigning these to, say, certain categories within our catalog that we've just looked at, and moving that into a review process that in this case I'm going to take responsibility for. So maybe I'm responsible for adding the glossary terms that we spoke about. Maybe I'm responsible for classifying the content, so it's internal and actually it contains PII data because we're looking at our sales team here. Maybe I'm adding documentation to the content before it goes out. But ultimately, in this case, I'm responsible for the content. I'm going to categorize it. I'm going to save it. and then move it into a state where this is sort of completed and certified within our environment. So it moves into that certified state. It gets that green stamp of approval with all our context. And ultimately, that is going to end up within our catalog as a published piece of content here now that other users have access to. And similarly to what we looked at before, they're going to get access to any of the content that I put in here, that preview we were looking at before. So the catalog to organize everything, the workflows to get things into the catalog in a governed way. The final piece I want to touch on for the last 5 minutes, and then we'll see if there's any questions, is the measurement of success and the measurement of the process itself. And I suggest to you, when you think about measurement, you should think about it from those two perspectives. So how do we measure the governance process in terms of, is it happening? Well, you can measure the process at any stage. So how many pieces of content are getting added to the portal? How many pieces of content are in a review process? Whatever technology you use, again, you should be able to measure those things. But then also from a sort of practice of the people involved. So, how much of our content is certified versus not by the individuals who are responsible for carrying out the process. And something that we've seen, I said up front, no one really gets up every morning excited and striving to carry out governance. But if we can sort of almost bring the measurement into play here as a sort of incentive for people, a friendly competition around, is content getting through the process, who's carrying out these things, and tie that to some of the things I'm going to look at in a minute, then that can sort of encourage people and make them a bit more enthusiastic about some of these things. So there's measurement of the process, and then how do we know whether this process is actually adding any value in the first place? And obviously, some governance things have to happen because of security and regulatory requirements. But governance should also be a way of driving better engagement with BI in our organization. So I don't think it's any surprise to anyone on this call that BI has suffered from low user engagement. And I think it's because we're sort of a victim of our own success in that we just keep churning out more and more content for people. And for business users, for people who think about BI for a couple of minutes every day, it's kind of overwhelming these days to figure out which reports and dashboards I should look at and trust. And so engagement with content is one way that we should see. It's one thing that we should see improve if we do a better job of governance. And so what your technology should support is some sort of way of measuring engagement. And engagement can simply be, the number of views that a particular piece of content is having over time, so that we can drill into, for every piece of content that we're pushing out there, by our different data sources, by the different categories and groups of users who are accessing it, over time, what engagement is this content getting? What reports are most popular? What's increasing in popularity? What's decreasing? What's going unused? And hopefully what we'll see is that over time, we get to see this increase in engagement with the content that we're pushing out there in a governed way, because users can find it easily, because they trust it, because they have the context behind it. And that should be something that we report on in actually a pretty detailed way. So not just say that this particular report had 165 views over time, but over that 60 days, are people coming in on a regular basis and looking at it every day? Or is it something we publish and it gets looked at once, but then people drift to the outside of this animation because they don't find it useful? So having this usage information married with the measurement of the governance process gives you some confidence that what you're doing is actually having a positive effect. Another thing I would encourage you to measure as well is within the portal related to engagement is if you're categorizing your content, and one of the goals of that is to make sure people can find it easily, then you should be measuring things like your search success as well. So if users are coming in and searching for content in the way that I showed before, are they actually finding results and clicking into that content? Or are they seeing things that just don't have the context and don't encourage them to go and look at it? And again, this is a good way of saying, okay, is the governance and categorization that we put in place having that positive effect and making sure that people can find and stumble across the content that they actually require to do their job? And then finally, ultimately, it's about overall, are we seeing a better engagement with business users in our organization as it relates to BI? So across all our content and all our BI, are we seeing a good increase in the adoption of what we're pushing out there? Because a good governance process should, again, drive an increase in adoption. So that's what I have for you today. Hopefully, again, that's given you some techniques, some ideas that you could take back to your organization and hopefully implement in your world. I'm happy to have people reach out if you have questions, if we have some sort of documented toolkits around some of the things I've spoke about, and we can share those with you. But if there's any questions right now, then I'd be happy to answer those. So I'll hand it back to you, Eric.
Thanks, Mike, for that insightful presentation. We'll open up for Q&A now and encourage attendees to submit their questions using the chat feature. So let's jump right in and work on the first question, and that is BI governance different from data governance?
So again, I think it's, as I said up front, I think it's semantics. Why I like to use a different term to data governance is because I think inherently when you think about data governance, the governance of the analytics piece, the visualizations themselves often gets forgotten. So at the end of the day, what we call it doesn't really matter, but I would just encourage you to remember that, if you're calling it data governance or if you're calling it BI governance, make sure you remember about the analytics. It's not just against those individual fields in your database to make sure that the sales number is correct. It also has to be visualized in an effective way. So again, semantics, but think about the
next question process is related, and that is analytics governance part of BI governance?
Yeah, again, same thing. Absolutely. Call it what you want, but make sure you're thinking of it as a soup to nuts kind of process.
Okay, and the following question is, what catalog did you use?
So there's a nuance here that I want to talk about. So what you were looking at in that demonstration is actually the metric insights catalog, where we can organize the BI content. So that's what you were looking at there. There are tools out there that tools like Elation or Calibra, which are a little bit more focused, again, semantics again, a little bit more focused on sort of the cataloging of your underlying data structures, your underlying data sets, and there's an overlap. The metric insights catalog actually integrates with tools like that. So if you are defining terms and definitions in, say, a tool like Elation or Calibra or just some other source, you can actually synchronize that with the metric insights catalog, where users are accessing all your analytics and your BI reports and dashboards, so that things like in that preview of the sales report I was looking at, that data classification field may be coming from another source. But what you were looking at in that demonstration was
cool.
The metric
the next question has to do with the de-identified data. And that question is, do you need governance around de-identified data? And if so, what kind would you suggest?
Sorry, so I'm just trying to see the
That's
question
right.
here.
That's the term the questioner used.
Was that what you said, Eric? Yeah, I'm not. I'll be honest. I'm not sure what you're referring to in terms of de-identified. So maybe jump into the comments and add some clarification.
Moving to the next question,
and come back to that.
That question is the certification part of the workflow?
Yeah, so certification typically, we see as sort of the end result of a workflow, and there may be differing sort of levels of certification. A piece of content may go through a process where, again, the data's checked, we add the categorization and the fields, we add the classification, and ultimately, once we're all happy with it, that's when certification happens. Someone gives it that stamp of approval at that point in time, and then it gets published to the wider audience. So certification becomes a check mark on the content. And as I said within the slides, certification often isn't a one-time thing as well. So it gets certified, but then changes or time elapsed or a calendar event may end up decertifying a particular report or dashboard so that it goes back into the queue and ultimately ends up, going through the process of certification again. But yes, certification is part of the workflow process, and it's typically that end result. And I just saw Amanda jumped into the chat. So yeah, the opposite of PII is de-identified data, de-identified information, and yes, that is, still you want to govern content that perhaps doesn't have PII data, right? Its governance shouldn't just be about security and data, as hopefully you've seen in this presentation. It's also about giving the user context around that. So, oftentimes what we see in our catalog is things like PII versus DI actually functionally controls what a user can do with a piece of content. So it's important to mark it, i.e., if it is marked PII, automatically within the system, I cannot download or share or print that content, versus if it's marked as DI, I can actually download and share that content.
The next question is, we struggled with setting roles and responsibilities in our governance process and making those roles and responsibilities stick. Do you have any advice for us?
Yeah, I think it's about identifying, obviously and this may sound obvious, but what I see in a lot of organizations is inherently we kind of dump everything onto the BI team to fulfill some of those roles and responsibilities that I spoke about within the slides. And the challenge there is it kind of becomes a one-stop shop in terms of blame for some of this stuff. And that's not what we're trying to achieve. So I think by sort of distributing those roles and responsibilities and ultimately showing that to the end consumers of content actually encourages people to get involved. So what I said up front was governance can sometimes happen in this vacuum with more of the technical folks. And ultimately, the business users kind of don't even know what the governance is going on and don't care about it. Versus if you start to expose some of that process, and I, as an end consumer of content, know that John within the sales operations team has actually been involved with governing this content, and I can actually reach out to him if I have questions around it. And Julie in our data team has been involved, and I can actually see that she's been involved and who's been involved from the BI team. And actually, that is something that the end user themselves has visibility into. I think as people responsible for the process, what we see is a lot of collaboration then happens between the business and the people governing the content, which actually gives me a good feeling that what I'm doing is actually having some value from an end user perspective. And that can help, encourage people to get involved. And obviously the usual things as well, like, having sort of centers of excellence that, have a more sort of vested interest in carrying out the process, and using that to encourage other groups across the organization can help. But I would say, the main thing we see is expose the work to everyone, because everyone likes to have their work recognized and seen in a useful light.
Our next question is, what's the biggest mistake you've seen companies make in terms of determining which components to include in their business intelligence technology stack, and how did they solve that mistake?
So which components to include in the stack? So I think ultimately, again, and that's a broad question, right? If I think about the question in terms of the governance flows that we've been talking about, then again, I think it's about understanding in your organization what governance means, and not again as a one size fits all, but as what governance means for each of the types of content that you're going to be creating. Are you a highly regulated organization that ultimately a lot of the content that you're going to be producing requires a lot of scrutiny? Because if that's the case, then your technology stack is probably going to be a bit more involved. You may introduce sort of a data catalog like an Elation alongside more of an analytics catalog like we're looking at with Metric Insights, and having those things work together and having a workflow engine that allows you to implement these processes in a very governed way, versus someone at the other end of the scale where all we're really making sure is the content that we're consuming is as good and accurate as possible, has had the checks and balances, it may be lighter weight. So again, I think it's about it's about not over engineering for who you are, but making sure you don't have gaps that hamper you as part of the process.
Last and final question. What's next in the field of business intelligence governance? Are there anything new and exciting coming down the pike?
So I think what is new is this concept of the governance of analytics. I think if you ask anyone about governance, as I've been saying all along, it is very much about data governance, and end users are not getting value out of that. And so what's exciting to me is being able to have technologies from an end user perspective leverage these governance capabilities. So things like if we understand content more and how it's categorized and who's using it, because it's been published in a much more governed way, we can get much smarter about delivering analytics to end users. Right now, it really falls on the end user to figure out what's useful and what they should be looking at from a reporting and BI perspective, versus technology and almost things like getting into more sort of AI and machine learning that can look at what's happening with content because it's being put there in a much more governed way, and start to make recommendations and suggestions to end users. So simple things like, if I'm responsible for sales, the engine should know what sales content is out there, how it's defined, which has been governed versus not, what's been certified, who's using it. Are there other people in the organization in an affinity to my role who are using that content, and almost make recommendations and serve it up to me. So, I think the innovations are going to be less about the sort of collection of the governance information, but using it in an effective way to drive better engagement with BI and analytics in the organization.
Thanks everyone for joining us today for this fantastic webinar. Thanks again, and please enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Appreciate the good questions.